On the last video I posted, I got loads of comments asking me to remake the VFX from Ben10, so that's what today's video is all about. Here's a short transformation scene I made, taking inspiration from the cartoon. It's a super fun effect. Some of the VFX work that I've done here is obvious, for example the CG Omnitrix and the hologram, but there's also a few subtle effects that bring the whole effect together. For example, painting out the reflections of the practical lights in my glasses and replacing them with a reflection of the hologram. Oh, and this wasn't shot outside. I filmed this entire first shot in my living room so that I had more control over the practical lighting setup. This had a lot of benefits, but it also presented some challenges that I didn't foresee, and I'll talk about that more as I go. So let's get stuck in. The very first thing I did for this video was get together all the 3D assets. For the model of Heatblast, I just sourced this 3D model and downloaded it online. Once the model was downloaded, I rigged it again myself, and improved some of the shaders slightly to make them more photorealistic. I found a few models of the Omnitrix, but they were all quite cartoony. So I decided, as it's quite a simple model, I would just make my own. Shameless self-plug, if you'd like to get any of the assets from this video, they're all available on my Patreon. You can download the 3D models that I've made with all the textures and rigging, as well as the Blender and Nuke project files to mess around with yourself. So I threw the model together based on a few reference images, and then applied some simple PBR materials. I improved some of the materials by adding fingerprints and scratches, as well as painting some grunge maps by hand. I also painted on some lines for this green circuit board material, and I created a control in the shader for this that would allow me to animate the light up and down when the Omnitrix turns on. Okay, let's talk about how I did the two shots. Logically, let's start on the first one. I did kind of a day for night compositing trick with this shot. I started by keying the highlights in the shot, which was all the street lights and the lights in people's windows, and then inverted that key so it was selecting everything else in the shot, and used that to drop the exposure. Then I did a second luminance key for the sky, and I used this to drop the sky's exposure even further. Then it was time to tackle the foreground plate of me on the blue screen. I drew a garbage mat around myself, so I'm only keying the bits that I need to, and used the key light node in Nuke to key out the blue. I did a few keys to preserve as much detail as possible in my hair, as well as my clothes and everything. And I also despilled the blue screen to a much darker, less saturated colour. This trick really helps with reducing any blue edges that come through in the foreground when you overlay it on a background plate. The background was filmed totally in focus, but I knew that when I was compositing this I would make it slightly softer to give the scene some depth. I defocused the background using a kernel to get some interesting bokeh, as well as drawing a mask for some of the foreground objects so they would have slightly less defocus, which gives the shot a little bit more three-dimensionality. With the foreground and background roughly combined, I then exported the zoomed in version where I'd composed the shot properly to Blender, and used this plate to do an object track on for the Omnitrix. I put my running watch on while filming this and added a tracking marker onto it to aid the tracking, but mainly the thought process here was to give my fingers something to interact with when they're twisting parts of the watch. I did a single point track on the watch and then solved this to an empty and 3D space that's linked to the camera. Because I'm not moving my arm around very much in the shot, it's quite forgiving, so I didn't need any rotation data. And then once it was tracked, I added the animation for the part of the watch to pop out, added some keyframes onto the lights to make them turn on, and then 2 rotation keyframes for the twist. I also brought in a generic model of a man and used the arm model from that as a holdout, so that it would occlude the inside of the watch that should be behind my wrist. To make sure the lighting in the scene was being occluded by my body just like in real life, I exported the keyed version of the blue screen out of Nuke and put that on a plane behind the watch with some transparency. That way the cutout version of me would block any lighting and also maybe show up in some of the reflections on the metal. Then I rendered this out and it was time to put it together in Nuke. I did all the standard stuff when comping CG renders, so I set the black point to be the same as the footage of me, added some subtle defocus as my arm is slightly out of focus in the foreground, and then tracked on a mask for a subtle contact shadow on my wrist underneath the watch. By shuffling out the emission pass, I can use this to tweak the lights independently, and then at the bottom add some glow onto the lights as well. At this point, I rotate my fingers back on top, so the finger in the foreground will appear on top of the CG render. I made a mask for the top of the watch and cut this out using a green constant, tracked this on top, and then used a volume raise node underneath it to create that projector effect. I also multiplied some noise over the top of the mask, which creates more detail in the rays. For the hologram itself, I brought in the model of Heatblast, scaled it down into the scene, and then rendered one frame in a neutral pose. I brought this back into Nuke and combined it with a 2D element of a fireball that I had, and then shuffled out the alpha so I just had a white silhouette of the character. From here, I used a few gradients and edge to text to create the slightly more interesting look of the hologram. This element is also tracked to the watch, and then I did a few keyframes when it slides on, where it moves on from the right hand side, and I also scaled it down just in the width, which kind of made it feel like it was rotating in on a cylinder, rather than just sliding into place in 2D. The volume rays on their own look pretty cool, but at the moment they're extremely clean and I always just think they look a bit fake. So I dug through my 2D elements library and found some plates of some dust swirling around, and I multiplied this into the volume rays, and it makes it look like they're actually illuminating particles that are floating around in the shot. As you saw at the beginning, I did a transition between the two shots, which is essentially made from a few frames where I blow out the shot completely to white with a green flash. To start with, I took the alpha from the blue screen key and multiplied some noise on top of this. Then I used another volume raise node and used that broken up alpha as the emission for the raise. I graded it to be green and then played around with the scale until I found something that I thought looked good, and then keyframed their intensity to go right up to the point where they're leaving the frame at the end of the shot. Underneath this, I added a soft glow just coming off of the raise, but you can see here it looks quite fake because you have this really hot light source that's comped over a plate of me that has none of that light in it. It's very difficult to fake this, which is why I used the practical LED tube instead of doing the light on my face in compositing. However, there was no way for me to also get this green flash in camera, so because it's just a few frames, I actually hand painted all the light interaction. Firstly, I did an animated grade where I literally keyed the highlights, and then for the last couple of frames of the shot, I turned them up a lot higher and made them go green. Then I used a second grade node on myself and basically did the same thing again but pushed it really far. Instead of using this on the whole shot, I put it off to the side and used a paint node to reveal this through with my paint strokes. So as you can see here, I'm just painting in the light interaction where you would see it. So I mostly painted it onto the edges of my arms in the foreground, onto bits of my jacket, and the underneath of my face to light it up. It doesn't look that fantastic, but because it's only 2 frames, you get away with it and it's a lot better than nothing. I also had to rebuild all of my arm that was covered by the blanket, and that was not very fun. Then, unfortunately, we have those pesky reflections of the tube in my glasses. This was another quite tricky bit of cleanup. Once those reflections were removed, I then had a nice clean canvas to put some CG reflections back on top. So I duplicated the hologram, scaled it down to be smaller in the frame, and then screened this over the top of my glasses. And that was the final cherry on top. With all of those things combined, this is what the first shot looks like. Okay, on to the second shot. I started a new Blender scene, added a camera, and set the focal length to be the same as the lens I had on my camera when I filmed this, which was 25mm. Then I brought in my background plate and used the grid floor in Blender to align the floor with the CG floor. I also animated a reverse crash zoom at the beginning of the shot. I worked backwards from my end position, so I keyframed the camera at its widest, and then went back a few frames and pushed the camera forward a lot, and roughly matched it to the framing that I had of myself in the previous shot. Then by tweaking the curves a little bit so it's not a complete linear move, I get a nice pull out as the transition with the flash is happening. Once the camera was in the correct place, I modelled some quick set geometry so I could use this for lighting interaction. I made some low poly versions of the cars and the vans, as well as the big plant pots that had some trees in on the right hand side. I took all of the set geometry and put it in its own collection, and I set all of the individual objects to be a shadow catcher. A super useful thing that you might not be aware of is that the shadow catcher in Blender also works as a light catcher. So for all of the objects that have light being cast on them by Heatblast, I can shuffle out the shadow catcher pass in Nuke and then multiply this over the plate. This allows me to overlay the lighting interaction onto the live action footage. On all of these objects, I then did a project from view unwrap and projected my plate onto them. I then used this projection to generate a bump map, which gives me some texture for the floor tiles, which really helps add some extra detail into the light interaction, because the light coming off of the 3D model actually bounces off some of the corners of the tiles, and you see the way it picks up on the uneven floor. I then duplicated all the geometry for the set and applied a glossy black material onto these instead, as well as turning off the HDRI so there was no scene lighting. I put these in a separate render layer and set the collection with Heatblast in to be indirect only, which means it will light up the shot and be seen in the reflections of the glossy materials, but you won't actually see him appear in the render. This basically just gives me a black render with some light for the reflections in the 3D models, which I can then screen on top of my plate in compositing to give me a reflection pass. The animation on Heatblast was very simple, but I'm a terrible animator, so I shot some reference for this just to make sure that it looked correct. I filmed myself on my phone doing the movements, and then synced this up on the timeline, so I could go through to the key poses and match up Heatblast's position to be the same. And now it's time to start compositing the second shot. First of all, obviously the CG render of Heatblast goes on. The textures the model came with were quite saturated and red, so in compositing I made sure to dial that back slightly and make sure that the saturation and exposure was correct for something that would be that bright in the shot. I can also bring in the shadow catcher render and multiply this over my plate, which gives me the lighting interaction with the environment. And then lastly, the reflection render. After that, I added in a couple of 2D fire assets as the transition happens. I tried to get their colour and saturation to match what I'd done with the 3D model, and then I put one behind the 3D render and one in front. This helps it feel a bit more 3D, even though they're just 2D elements. I also time offset them by a few frames and used that to drive some heat distortion. So I'm using the offset version of the fire to distort the plate as well as blur it slightly, which gives a nice heat haze effect. I wanted the 2D fire to feel like it was actually lighting up the 3D model, so I brought in the same elements on some transparent planes in Blender, set their emission strength to be quite high, and then positioned them around the 3D model. Again, I set these to be indirect only, so they don't show up in the render, but they cast light on Heatblast. And so he's rendered with some interactive lighting coming off of the fire, and then the actual fire elements go on during compositing. So the 3D render has that crash zoom that I was talking about earlier, but the background plate that I filmed for this is just shot on a tripod. So to get the same movement on the plate, I made some geometry that roughly matched the shape of the street that I was filming on, and then brought this into Nuke and projected my plate on this. I can hold that projection for a single frame and then have the render camera come through and film the actual camera move, which when I run it through a scanline render in Nuke gives me the same camera move on my footage as the Blender camera. Just to make it look even more funky, I applied a load of lens distortion and chromatic aberration onto the corners of the frame, so as the transition's happening it feels like the footage and the light is actually warping and bending around the edges of the camera. And for the crash zoom I also added some directional blur just to give it some more movement. And finally, if you've watched the cartoon, you'll know that Heatblast has a flaming head. I didn't have any suitable 2D elements for this, so I did a fire simulation in Blender. I made an emitter for the head that was the same sort of shape as Heatblast's head, and then parented that to the rig so it would move the same, and then added a quick smoke effect onto this which sets all the fire simulation and domain up for you, which is great. I did a few bakes at a low resolution just to see how the fire was moving and make a couple of tweaks, and then set off a final bake at a higher resolution once I was happy. The final stage was tweaking the shader slightly to control the fall off of the fire, and then it was ready to render. So I dropped in the final render of Heatblast with the flaming head, and again this is what that shot looks like, completely finished. I hope you think it looks cool. I had a really good time making these VFX. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. Consider dropping a like and subscribing if you enjoyed, and again if you're interested, the assets are on Patreon. Thanks for watching and I'll see you very soon.